Hey guys, welcome to another edition of Environmental Biology with Phil Pinzoni. This is lecture 4. We're going to be focusing on population growth, agronomy, and sustainability. So these things that are very much tied closely together. And yeah, we're going to see exactly what they have to do with each other. So population growth, we touched on last class. We're going to move towards agronomy, which is the study of plants that are going to be used for human society. So when it comes to crops, when it comes to plants like cotton and other fibrous plants that we use for textiles, there's a lot of science that goes in behind that, and we call that agronomy, the study of plant sciences for human use. And then we have sustainability, and we'll finally we'll end up learning about a lot of sustainable practices and that more modern agronomy. What modern agronomy is focused on a lot is making sustainable products. So we're going to look at how these three things interact in today's lecture. We'll get into one of my favorite American agronomists, Norman Borlaug, and see what he did to help feed the world. So without further ado, let's get started on today's lecture. So we looked at this figure last lecture, and you should be able to tell me what the x-axis is and what the y-axis is and what this figure is showing. So even though the y-axis is not labeled, that's going to be population number, and the x-axis, or the independent variable, is going to be time. So we have, as time progresses, we have the human population increase. And I picked this figure because it looks like it increases. In more modern times, it looks like human population is increasing at a decreasing rate, right? So it's increasing rather rapidly throughout the later 1900s, but past the year 2000, looks like it's still increasing, but increasing at a decreasing rate, right? And I wanted to show you this picture to lead us into today's lecture, which is focusing on the study of agronomy, which this specific discipline has helped maintain population growth on this planet, right? Before humans started to get the most out of their land, people were dying from famine from across the world. People are still dying to this day from famine. So this is an ongoing thing, but with the help of agronomy, we are increasing the amount of plants to feed people, yet is there carrying capacity on this planet for humans? Are we reaching our carrying capacity? Now I have another figure that's actually behind this graph that I'm going to show you. Let me see if I can get it. Okay. So this figure, we have this human population growth, and the difference between those two figures are the time scale. So in the first figure I showed you, it starts at 1700, right? So now if we zoom even further out, we're starting in the year 1050, and you could see human population, it is pretty much steady throughout the world, and then it turns exponential, right? So we have the steady population growth, and then as we approach 1850, right, we have this exponential growth. So this is how we usually see human population growth. However, if we zoom in on this section, it seems to increase at a slightly decreasing rate, kind of informing us that are we reaching our carrying capacity here on this planet? So think about scales, think about what you're looking at when you're looking at these figures. But clearly, human population has rapidly increased in more modern times. In the early to mid 1800s, we have several advancements that helped humans accelerate their population. So I'm going to go through many very important things that allowed humans to grow rapidly. One is advancements in pediatrics. So as we learn more about the human body and learn more about nutrition and applying these to treating illnesses and deficiencies in human babies and children, we had an incredible success with decreasing infant mortality, right? So just our medical advancements in pediatrics decreased the infant mortality around the globe. Next, we had the management of disease, vaccinations, sanitary reforms, and medicine in quarantine, right? The management of disease, right? As we learn more about, the micro scale, like we didn't even have microscopes 500 years ago, right? We didn't even know germs existed. We didn't know what bacteria was. There were hypotheses out there, but we couldn't see these tiny organisms. Now we understand viruses, we understand bacteria, information that our ancestors did not have. And with that, we've come up with vaccinations, right? We've come up with all these ways to combat these diseases, and we've been rather successful. Now, in modern times, I'm sure you've heard the term anti-vaxxers, which are basically these group of people. Unfortunately, there are famous actors and actresses who are anti-vaxxers, who are just spreading and spewing false information out there that is allowing some of these eradicated diseases to come back, right? So we're living in a crazy age, but at the end of the day, we still have a lot of people understanding and getting their kids vaccinated and accepting this modern medical information to help manage these diseases. This next bullet I briefly already touched on, advancements in microbiology, right? We didn't even know what a bacterium was 500 years ago, right? Today we're focusing on this fourth bullet point, which is advancements in agronomy. And you're going to have to write this down. Agronomy is the science and technology of producing and using plants for food, fuel, fiber, and land reclamation. So agronomy. We're going to focus a lot about agronomy. Number 5, we have modern technology, including engines, electricity, and transportation. Things we take for granted, right? Engines, electricity, and transportation. All of these things are used in agronomy to increase crop yield and move these plant products around the world to feed and clothe people, right? So these actually are tied in with agronomy. Finally, we have water treatment plants. Isn't it crazy that the toilet is just over 100 years old, right? Think about all that human waste that was not being properly dealt with, right? People were literally pooping in buckets and dumping it out their window. And can you imagine what like really populated cities smelled like? Can you imagine the diseases that were out there? Crazy, right? These are new developments that have allowed human population to increase so rapidly in more modern times. So now I want to introduce you to Norman Borlaug, born in 1914, died in 2009. He is pretty much the most famous American agronomist. And he believed in one thing so strongly, and that was that food is the moral right of all who are born into this world. Regardless of where you're born, he believed that every human had a right to food. And he did everything in his power to allow this idea to come into fruition, right? So if we look, starting in the 1950s, he started to utilize some of his techniques that he's come up with. Now, if you look at this graph above, starting in the 1950s is right when human population starts to increase heavily on this specific graph. So is this a coincidence? No. In the 50s, we had this green revolution come into existence, and we have all these new techniques that increase crop yield around the world. As crop yield greatly increased, human population also greatly increased. So you can see what he did in all these different parts of the world, right? So this is the yield of wheat, and in a very short time he greatly increased the yield of wheat around the world. We have Mexico, we have India, and we have Pakistan. Steadily increasing in India and Pakistan, greatly increasing in Mexico year to year, right? So because of this, more and more people were allowed access to food. So Norman Borlaug, he did several things, but we're going to learn about 3 things that Norman Borlaug did to increase and enhance crops around the world. Number 1 thing we're going to learn about is that he doubled the wheat season in Mexico. In one single year, he doubled the wheat season in Mexico. Norman Borlaug, I always try to teach about him regardless of what I'm teaching, because he was such a well-rounded individual. He didn't just have tunnel vision. He didn't stick in his field. He had a wonderful understanding of the natural world. And even though he studied plant pathology, which is, diseases that infect different plants, even though he studied plant pathology, he had a great understanding of geology. He had a great understanding of other parts of plant sciences and ecology. And he was such a good observer of natural systems that he was so well-rounded that he can try and he can problem solve, and he did problem solve using different disciplines. So I always teach about Norman Borlaug because that's what I want you guys to do. You're going to pick something to study, by the time you're a junior and senior, you're going to have a pretty specific trajectory. But I want you to take information that you have learned from other courses and classes and try applying those. Don't just throw away information that you have to learn to get, an A in classes that you think you're not going to use, right? Become well-rounded. Take subjects and take classes that, aren't required, that you can see yourself gaining tools and utilizing in your future. Become well-rounded like Norman Borlaug, right? So he had a great understanding of geography, right? Not only geology, but geography. and he understood the differences in elevation and all these different ideas that have to do with plant sciences. So if we look at Mexico, the equator is obviously more south, but you guys know that in the south, right, there's going to be more light. So he looked at different parts of Mexico and realized that you could actually grow wheat twice. Before Norman Borlaug, Mexico was, people were just growing wheat one time a year. He realized that if you grew wheat up in the mountains of Chipingo, you can actually grow wheat in the summer. Now, Chipingo's up in elevation, so it is high up in elevation, and because of that, it's cooler. He realized that you can grow wheat during the summer when in this region it was simply too hot to grow wheat. But because it's up in the mountain, it's cooler, you can actually grow wheat in Chipingo in the summer. So he did that. So he successfully grew wheat in the summer. And with a military convoy, he took tons and tons of seeds produced from many of those wheat, and he drove this convoy down in elevation to the Yaqui Valley. This is lower in elevation, and he grew wheat right after this summer growing season, essentially doubling the amount of wheat produced that year. That's crazy. So can you imagine having doubled the amount of wheat in a single year, feeding twice as much people? That's what he did in 1 year, with just his basic understanding of geography and elevation and how these plants respond to different elevation, right? Up in the mountains here, right? Around Chipingo at lower elevations, there's not a lot of water. Up in the mountains, water condenses and you have more available water. You have cooler temperatures to grow wheat. Driving down that convoy down in elevation during the regular growing season to the Yaqui Valley, doubling the season of wheat, right? He also challenged a common crop misconception. So before Norman Borlaug, people thought that when you collected seeds from wheat plants, when you collected those seeds had to sit for a year to mature. He thought that was just ridiculous. He's like, it's not on the plant. It's no longer receiving nutrients and energy from that plant. We can plant these seeds right away. So he challenged this common crop misconception, and guess what? Those seeds in the Yaqui Valley that were just freshly removed from the plants in Chipingo, they germinated, and he had his successful second crop. So he challenged those common crop misconceptions. The next thing he did, which he actually came up with two solutions to this one problem. And the one problem that he tried to aid was this rust. So there's this fungus called rust. And if you've ever walked with black sneakers, actually around this time of year, you're talking about early fall. If you ever walk across a field with black shoes and see orange dust on your black shoes, that orange dust is actually the spores of rust. And rust is a fungus that is a plant parasite that actually attacks and starts to consume the plant's tissue. So this picture is a blade of grass that has rust that is consuming this leaf material. Now there are 7,000 species, even more. There's even more than 7,000 species, but roughly 7,000 species of rust on our planet. And many of them parasitize the plants that we eat or use for textiles and such. When a crop gets infected with rust, that rust can readily move in between plants and it could totally decimate that crop, right? So he focused on trying to aid the reduction of rust when it comes to many plants. The first thing he did to combat rust was come up with multi-line varieties. So that's another red term, multi-line varieties. So I'm going to post some videos at the bottom of this, and you are going to watch those videos. They're going to have to do with different crops from around the world that are being decimated by certain types of pathogens. Now, many times in even present day crops, such as the banana, many crops that we use are actually monocultures. So monocultures are plants grown in a field that are actually genetically the same plants. So what happens when one plant is susceptible to a pathogen? If it's growing next to clones, if it's growing in a monoculture, if one plant is susceptible to a fungus like rust, they all are susceptible to rust. So Norman Borlaug used his brain again, and he realized that he can grow plants that are genetically dissimilar, multi-line varieties. So he came up with fields of wheat that were multi-line. They had different individuals that have different genomes. Like you and I have a totally different genome. I might be more susceptible to certain sicknesses, right? Same things happening in his field of wheat. So by coming up with multi-line varieties, he reduced the amount of rust infestation, right? So another term that we use monocultures is pure lines. And these pure lines or monocultures, again, are notoriously vulnerable to pathogens and diseases. Now another term that is important is phenotypically similar. So guess what happens when he started to grow multi-line varieties? Because they're genetically dissimilar, right? Some plants would grow really fast and tall, and other plants would grow slower and just end up being shorter. So he had this field of wheat that was multi-line that had these different individuals that would mature at different times. So it wasn't just as easy as coming up with multi-line varieties. He had to come up with multi-line varieties that were phenotypically similar. And now what does that mean? Phenotype, plant phenotype, are the characteristics you see in a plant, right? So a short plant and a tall plant are phenotypically not the same, right? The characteristics of the short plant are it's short. A phenotypic characteristic of a tall plant is that it's tall, right? So he actually bred different multi-line varieties, so individuals of plants that were genetically different that had similar phenotypes, that grew up in similar conditions, that matured at the same time. Because guess what? When you do come up with phenotypically similar plants, they're going to mature and grow at the similar rates, And then you could take your machinery and collect all the plants at once. Now, phenotypically dissimilar plants are going to mature at different rates. And what are you going to do? Hand pick the crops that are ready and leaving the ones that still need to mature? No, that costs more money. So what did Norman Borlaug do? He came up with genetically dissimilar plants across his entire crop that were phenotypically similar. So I'm actually going to draw this out for you guys. Basically, Norman realized some underlying mechanisms that were happening with rust and the infectivity of rust on wheat plants. He was literally looking at a field of wheat, and it was a rather windy day. He soon realized that with a gust of wind, the wheat wouldn't just stay upright, it would actually topple over. And he soon realized that, before I get into that, the rust actually infects the top, which contains the part of the plant that we actually eat, known as the cereal. Now he realized that the actual top of the wheat in a really windy day would actually touch the ground. So he actually took some of this soil into the lab, and guess what he found? Looking through a microscope, he found the spores of rust. So he came up with an ingenious solution. He realized that if he came out with strains of wheat that were small, shorter, that wind would not be able to actually push the crowns of the plant into the ground. In a greenhouse experiment, he started to grow several wheat plants, right, in these little planters. So this is a top-down view of a 5x5 planter, right? So there's a young wheat plant and all these little planters, right? And as the wheat would mature, at the end of a regular growing season, he would select the shortest individuals, he would cross them, so he would take pollen and actually pollinate each of these plants with each other and produce seeds with these three plants and actually do a generation 2 with those plants' offspring. Right? Then he would wait another growing season and take the shortest plants from this generation, right? Because we have generation 1, we have generation 2. He would do the same thing, cross-pollinate them, produce 25 more seeds, and I'm just, using that as just an example, and do a third generation. Now, after 8 generations, right? So he would again do this again, right? We have 3 of the shortest individuals again, and he would do again. This is G3, he would do G4, he would do G5, G6, G7. After the 8th generation, the original wheat that was that tall was now dwarfed. And wind that would originally topple over the G1 wheat was no longer able to topple over the dwarf wheat. Right? So he actually decreased the amount of rust in these fields by a ridiculous percent. He enhanced all of these individuals, and they no longer would get infected by rust by just looking and understanding the actual mechanism of these spores. Now, one more thing actually happened that he did not think would happen, and that is the actual grains that we consume was much more nutritious on the dwarf plants than the G1 plants. And that is because instead of the plant, so these are plants, right? Plants are taking in sunlight, right? Plants are taking in sunlight, right? Using that sunlight to produce structures and sugars, right? So instead of allocating energy to this long stalk, right? Because this stalk requires energy from photosynthesis, right? Instead of allocating all this energy towards the stalk, these dwarf plants had much less energy to allocate to their short stalk, and instead they allocated more of their energy into the grains that we eat. So because of that, not only was there a higher yield because less plants would succumb to rust, but the actual stuff that we eat became more packed with nutrients. So his understanding of these pathogens changed the way we carry out agronomy, right? Doubled the wheat season in Mexico. He came up with multiline varieties, and he used wheat dwarfing to combat just, this pathogen that was decimating crops from around the world. All in all, Norman Borlaug is said to have saved more people than anybody ever on this planet. 1 billion people he saved from starvation. He initiated the Green Revolution, and finally in 1970, he was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. So, one of my idols. In his later years, there is some controversy because he was always on board with using pesticides to help feed the earth or help feed the people of this earth, and sometimes those pesticides ended up being detrimental to nearby ecosystems and such. But he was just doing his part to fulfill what he believed in so much, which is that everybody had a right to food, no matter what country you came from, no matter where you grew up, you have a right to food. And he tried his best to allow that to happen. Moving forward on to sustainability. So sustainability is the property of biological systems to remain diverse and productive indefinitely. The key word is indefinitely, right? So sustainable development is actually meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, right? So in a clear-cut forest, in clear cuttings, loggers just cut all of the trees down. They're meeting their current needs, right? You can create a lot of products with that timber from clear cutting. But guess what? Many of the times after clear cutting, the forest does not regenerate. The forest might turn into a grassland. So future generations won't be able to create wood products from that area that was decimated by clear cutting. Clear cutting is not sustainable. Now selective logging, right, taking just the mature individuals or maybe just a few species from a stand of trees is much more sustainable because you might be able to satisfy your current needs without ruining the chance for future generations to meet their needs, right? So sustainability is definitely this far-sighted goal and this interaction that we are realizing we should take more part in to allow future generations to access these different resources. There are 3 pillars of sustainability. We have economy, society, and environment. Now these 3 pillars are going to be constrained by the environment. So we shouldn't exceed what our environment can provide us, because if we do exceed what our environment can actually sustainably produce, eventually societies and the economies of those societies will fail. I love this quote: "What use is a sawmill without a forest?" If there's no new trees and no new regeneration of forests, that sawmill is gonna stop, right? So it's a really great quote that adequately describes that these 2 nested economy and societal pillars, they're nested within the environment. They can't exceed what the environment can provide. Once that happens, the system crumbles. Now we're going to move into more common recent agricultural developments, and I'm going to focus on this northern part of Europe, a country known as the Netherlands, and how they have totally changed the agricultural game. Now this is a tiny country. This country's like smaller than New York State, right? It's densely populated. It has 1,300 inhabitants per square mile. But this small place on this planet is actually the globe's number 2 exporter of food as measured by value. They're only second to the United States in this exportation of food. And the United States is 270 times larger than the Netherlands. How does it do this? And I want you to look at this. I mean, I know it's a small map, but it is north, right? It is more northern than our own, where we live, than our own latitude, right? Because it's so far from the equator, it's not going to have a lot of sunlight throughout the year, and it's going to be rather cold. So how is it the number 2 exporter in terms of value of food if it's this north, if it's this far away from the equator? How do they do it? And it's because of these amazing greenhouse complexes. So this is the future, right? As our planet, as our environment and the climate of our planet becomes more random, right? Some positions have crazy heat waves followed by frost, right? Our planet, the weather and our climate is more and more unpredictable each year. So a great way to combat this is the development of these massive greenhouse complexes. And the Netherlands, they're already ahead of the game because they had to create these greenhouses to grow plants in the first place, right? Each acre of greenhouse yields as much lettuce as 10 outdoor acres, right? And they cut the need for chemicals by 97%. So in an enclosed greenhouse, these agronomists, they can control basically everything. With all this control, you have this really amazing yield. So here's a picture of these greenhouses. These greenhouse complexes are absolutely massive, right? And at nighttime you can see that there's these LED lights going on. The plants are photosynthesizing without sunlight, right? With the use of electricity and these high efficient photosynthetic light bulbs, right? Photosynthetic active radiation of these high-tech LEDs. You can grow plants throughout the year, throughout the winter, in all light environments, and they are fine-tuning their crop sciences. They're fine-tuning these greenhouses. So every year they're increasing their crop yield because they aren't just, this is how we grow tomatoes. No, they are constantly trying to increase yield. In this specific picture on the right, I love this picture, right? What color LEDs do you see? I see red and I see blue. What did we learn about plants? What type of spectrum do plants utilize to photosynthesize, right? Most plant leaves are green. Are plants that have green tissues using parts of the green spectrum? They're not, right? This was our first lecture? I think it was. Maybe our first or second lecture. We learned that most plants, they actually reflect green light. Their pigments absorb other spectrum like blue and red. They aren't even using green. So these researchers, they know that. Why would you waste electricity on producing green spectrum if the plants don't even use green spectrum, right? It's more efficient energetically. It's more sustainable to fine-tune the ratio, not even just the actual spectrum that the plant uses, but these tomato plants actually use a 4-to-1 ratio of red to blue spectrum. They realize that. So these plants grow the fastest when they have this specific ratio of spectrum. And in this study, they were actually trying to see a different combination of lighting that increased crop yield. Not only did they have lights above the plant shining directly down, but they wanted to see how plants would interact with light at their halfway point. So not just shining from above, but shining from the side. And they actually learned that they got a higher crop yield if they shined these lights on the top and from the side, right? So they are the, they're leading the world in food exportation for this reason. They're not stopping, they're not settling, they're continuing to learn about the plants they're growing, they're continuing to try and get the most out of their plants. And I'm going to link this video below too. The challenge is that by 2050, the Earth will be home to nearly 10 billion humans. So to put that in bluntly apocalyptic terms, the planet must produce more food in the next 4 decades than all farmers in history have harvested over the past 8,000 years, right? So our ancestors have been growing plants. You've heard of ancient Mesopotamia. There has been some evidence that even before Mesopotamia there were people growing crops. And if you weigh all of the crops throughout time up until now, we're going to have to match that in the next 3 to 4 decades. How are we going to do that? We're going to do that with vertical farming. We're going to have to do that in cities. Think about skyscrapers, but instead of offices and people working in front of computers, plants growing in these really sophisticated vertical greenhouses. That is the future, because that is the most sustainable way we are going to grow crops in this country and on this planet. So talking about sustainability, we're going to shift gears a little bit into energy and energy consumption. Now, fossil fuels, although we know that when you hear fossil fuels, you think of, dirty energy and maybe it's like man-made. It is pretty dirty energy, but fossil fuels are created naturally by natural processes. So another thing that you might have heard that's misleading is that fossil fuels are dead dinosaurs, right? That when you pump up your gas at the gas tank, you're putting liquefied dinosaurs in your tank. That is not true, right? Now, after, millions of years, you get buried organic material. There's an order of magnitude more buried plant material than there is animal material. So yes, you are, the long chain carbons that make up oil, they are organic, right? They do come from an organic source, but not dinosaurs. It's going to be buried plant material that bacteria then anaerobically decompose and release these long chains of polycarbons that then can combust in your engine, and we harness that combustion in machinery that allows engines to run. Now think about it. If this is a process, if this is a natural process, we have to think about sustainability, right? So do you think we're taking more fossil fuels than the Earth is actually creating? Most definitely. Humans are taking much more fossil fuel away from these reserves than the actual Earth is producing. So even though there is a large amount of untapped reserves, this is not sustainable. Eventually we will run out, and then what, right? So we have to talk, and we have to learn about these interactions, because this is environmental biology and we're learning about sustainability. Fossil fuels are not sustainable. Now, sustainable energy, these are some examples of sustainable energy. We have geothermic, right? Geo is the Latin root for earth, right? So geothermic, and thermic is referring to heat. So in places that are resting above magma chambers, you can actually dig these trenches, and the deeper you go, the warmer it gets, and you could actually pump water down those trenches, and as it goes deeper, steam will be produced, and you could actually use that steam to spin turbines, right, to actually create electricity. So that's geothermic energy. We have wind power. We have these wind turbines that, again, wind passing through spins those turbines, electricity is created. There's no shortage of wind, right? These are sustainable. It does cost us energy to create these turbines and this machinery, but it is much more sustainable than fossil fuels. We have hydropower, right? In our own backyard. You guys have heard of the physicist and scientist Nikola Tesla. He actually created the largest hydro-powered turbine of its time on the Niagara River, right? A 15-minute drive, right? We can see Nikola Tesla's his infrastructure that he put into motion to actually, similar to wind power, water current is passed through these turbines. These turbines spin, electricity is created, Buffalo, and some of this energy is actually sent to New York City, right? Then we have solar energy. Solar energy is very exciting. It seems like every year there's some new technology that increases the efficiency of these solar panels. The more efficiency you get out of them, the more sustainable they're going to be. There are nations leading the way in terms of sustainability. Sweden has eliminated its dependence on fossil fuels, and it is actually powering its country with garbage, literally. So, interestingly enough, it's actually run out of its own garbage to run these garbage powered facilities. So they literally burn garbage and use that heat to create electricity. It's importing garbage from other European nations. Now students are like, how is burning garbage good? And it's not that good. I'll give you that, right? I mean, obviously there are some toxic materials, and greenhouse gases do escape this combustion, right? But it cuts back on the amount of fossil fuels and the amount of mining and all the negative implications associated with that. So there are certain things to weigh, and it's not like they're just burning garbage and this soot is flying back in the environment. There are a series of filters that this hot air has to pass through before it can get into the atmosphere. And again, there are new developments in filtration, and eventually, after replacing these filters with more efficient ones, this is just getting cleaner and cleaner as time progresses, as technology increases. So that's a really cool idea there. We have Denmark. We have Costa Rica. Costa Rica really leads the way in Central America. Nicaragua is also in Central America, leading the way. Now, we learned about the formation of Central America. It's this place sitting on, active volcanoes. So in 2012, they used 92% sustainable energy. Most of that was in the form of geothermic. So they're tapping into their geothermic reserves and utilizing their own geothermic energy to create electricity. Iceland, like Central America, is resting on these massive magma chambers. They 100% use geothermic energy, which is crazy. Scotland, Germany leads Europe in solar and wind energy output. Uruguay is also up there in terms of sustainability. And China, when you hear, usually people are not expecting China to be leading the way in sustainable practices, but they are leading the world in hydro and solar energy, and they come second in wind power. Now, I created this slide 2 years ago, so I mean, these numbers can be even greater for China. China has put a ton of resources into creating more sustainable energy practices. Finally, I just want to touch on recycling. Those of you who have gone to Europe, you have seen all these different trash bins and all these different color-coded garbages. It's not just recycling and garbage. When I've gone to Italy, there's been a glass recycling bin, a plastic recycling bin, a garbage that's not compostable, and a compostable garbage bin. So sometimes I'm encountered with 4 different bins, and I'm just like, wow, this is amazing. Like, when humans sort their garbage before, that means that less machinery has to sort it, right? And it cuts down on cost. And already it's more sustainable. When you have all these recycling options, people are going to recycle more. And you guys know, reuse, recycle, reduce, reuse, and recycle. Obviously, that we should all know. Recycling is huge. As human population increases, we're going to have to reuse things. We're going to have to get the most out of the products we create. And recycling, and different nations across Europe and across Asia are truly leading the way. I grew up in the town of Tonawanda, which is 15 minutes away from Buffalo State. And it wasn't until 10 years ago until we got these big recycling totes. I couldn't believe it took, the city of Buffalo got, recycling totes before the town of Tonawanda. It was absolutely ridiculous to me. But finally, we're making waves in increasing the amount that is recyclable to increase sustainability, right? So that concludes today's lecture. I want to leave you with these figures. I want us to understand, again, another theme from last lecture was this carrying capacity. And possibly, are we reaching our carrying capacity on our planet? It is possible. I think it's important for nations to take part in sustainable energy and agriculture to increase crop yields, to reduce the amount of plant pathogens and such, and to allow more food production. But there is definitely going to be a point where we just can't increase the amount of food we can create on this planet. I think we're still not even scratching the surface of food production, but these are themes that I want us to understand, and I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture. Stay tuned and stay focused on future lectures, and do your homeworks. If you have any questions or concerns, let me know. I hope you guys are doing good, and I will see you on next video.